May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Today I want to focus a little on what it means to be the point person and how it is necessary. And we find it over and over again that the Word of God is carried through a point person. Certainly in the Old Testament, we know who all those point people are, and they're not always perfectly wonderful people. In the New Testament, the principal point person is clearly Jesus. But look at Jesus' parables. Look at the way he teaches the Word of God. In the story, there's always a point person. You think about it. Whether it is the person traveling down the road or the Good Samaritan who helps him, you can choose which is your point person there. Or it's the prodigal son, or maybe it's the prodigal son's father. Again, you can choose your idea of which one is the point person. But in all of those parables, who's carrying the message in the story? And I want you to think about that as I go through some of what we've heard this morning and add a bit of my own. It was an ordinary day for Moses, in spite of the fact that he was on the lam, hiding away from Egypt in the land of Midian with his in-laws after killing an Egyptian who had been abusing a Hebrew man working for the Egyptians in slave-like, oppressive conditions. Moses had taken over the tending of Jethro's sheep and was doing the work of a shepherd, taking the sheep from their fold, moving the sheep around the grazing area, fending off predators, bringing the sheep home to the fold at the end of a day. He had not, on the day of our story, prepared for a bush that burns without disintegrating into a pile of ash, and certainly not for a disembodied voice. But the story tells us that Moses did see a non-burning burning bush, and he did hear a very commanding voice that gave him marching orders he didn't want to follow. The voice, who identifies itself as I am, orders him to go to Pharaoh and demands that the Israelites, the Hebrew people, be allowed to leave Egypt. Yeah, sure. Moses murdered an Egyptian, and now at the direction of a no-name voice, he's supposed to go back to the scene of the crime and tell Pharaoh to let my people go? Well, we know the outcome of the story. Somehow Moses had either unshakable faith and trust in the voice, or he's more afraid of it than of losing his life when he returns to Egypt, but he accepts the mission impossible. There will be threats against Hebrews, plagues on Egyptians, and finally the night of the Passover, the march to the Red Sea, the parting of the waters and the unparting of the waters, the drowning of the Egyptian army, and the Israelites, the Hebrew tribes, are in for a 40-year hike in a land long ago promised to Abraham and his heirs. It takes a person. Moses accepted the clear and unmistakable call and carried out I am's orders. Jesus accepted God's call and lived into its consequences, even though Peter will try to stop Jesus from putting himself in danger. And we hold up their total commitment and occasionally try to walk the walk ourselves. Moses is among the many focal persons in the wonderful stream of stories in the Old Testament. And in these stories, over and over again, God calls individual persons to speak God's words and perform God's will. And those people are rarely, if ever, vetted saints. They are very imperfect and often insecure human beings. What they have in common is acceptance of the focal person role. They will be, capital B-E, they will be for capital I am. We need a focal person, a person of unwavering commitment who embodies the cause, a person who sees the signs, hears a voice, follows its path. For us as Christians, Jesus is that focal person, willing to carry the word, to be the word, even to the cross. But most of us have not had the clear signs that assure us either that we are the focal person or that we know for sure if or when we are called and by whom. We haven't seen burning bushes or voices that come from nowhere but speak very clearly, but perhaps we've known someone who has had an experience they heard or understood as an unmistakable message from God. One of my seminary mates received such a message that led her to seek ordination. The tragedy was that the call message did not echo among those who in our tradition make ministry decisions for the church. And the only messages I received about my own ordination process were from very human clergy and lay members of St. Mark's Cathedral congregation in Salt Lake City. And I was very aware that the decision, at least in my case, was a community decision. So I asked only that those involved would help me to discern the path I might take as a Jesus follower. Moses seemed to be aware that if he went to his people and told them about the bush and the voice, they would not immediately affirm his role. Why the name is the ticket to success of our story, I've never been quite sure, but it does indeed identify the voice as a verb. I am, I be, I do. And I am chose a person, Moses. And some thousands of years later, I am chose Jesus to carry the message of freedom, of hope, of love, of life. Some years ago, a member of my family who was disabled in limited use of upper body and total paralysis of lower body told me something that has stuck with me whenever I want to promote a cause. He said, it takes a person. If you want people to respond to a call, to a cause, you need to focus on a person whose life in some way represents the case you are trying to make. Perhaps like Moses, they're members of an oppressed group, or like Jesus, their experience or circumstances make them uniquely capable of carrying a message. And Larry Brayman, the family member of whom I'm speaking, was willing to be that cause, that person as needed. The accident that caused Larry's paralysis occurred in Vermont during a summer vacation when Larry was midway through college at Columbia as an architecture student. He dived into a lake he had jumped into for years, but he didn't know that this year the water level had been lowered for water management purposes. His mother was watching, and as soon as it was clear that he was unable to swim following his dive, she dived in and brought him to shore. It was years and years of rehab, but Larry remained determined to recover. He was surrounded by what really became a clan of friends who were close to him throughout his life, and his family adored him. He worked in several community development roles, and from the mid-90s, he worked for the cities of Boston and Cambridge to develop affordable and accessible housing. He was a go-to guy in those areas. In 1988, I came to Larry with an issue, And he gave me that bit of advice that continues to connect me to the stories of our faith traditions. It takes a person. And he agreed to be the person of focus for my issue. After Larry died, his friends published a book called Stories of Larry. I was going to bring it this morning, but that book is this wide, this high, that thick, and it's heavy. But it's an amazing piece of work by people who loved Larry. And to my surprise, his friends had taped the reception at Mount Auburn Cemetery that followed his interment. I had spoken there, and my words were recorded and are now in print. And I will close with the end of my remarks that day. Some of you know that I spent 3 years of my life, some 35 years ago, just down the street from Reedazel. That, by the way, is Reedazel Avenue, which is where my family's home was, and where there was a lot of gathering that Larry would be at regularly. At 99 Brattle Street, which was at that time, the Episcopal Divinity School. When graduation time came in 1988, it was apparent to me that Larry was not going to be able to attend all the events, most particularly anything that had to do with food, because the refectory, the main dining hall, was not accessible. My classmates rose up. All of the graduating class told the administration they would refuse to attend any event at commencement celebration that was not accessible to every member of a graduate's family. Within 2 weeks, a ramp was built that went into the refectory. It takes a person. Don't be afraid to ask the person. Don't be afraid to be the person. Amen.